After a long drive from Kutaisi, I was arriving late in the night in the Georgian capital Tbilisi, the third stop in this tour. By this time, when these images were taped, I was already congratulating myself for allotting extra days for rest, which I usually don't do, but I suspected they will be needed considering the long distances from one place to the other. And I was right. Although nowhere near as bad as in Ukraine, where everything is just really bloody far from anything, distances in the Caucasus have a charm of their own. What's seen as a short drive in Georgia is more in line with what Americans would call a short drive and much less what I would call short in mainland Europe. One thing to be noted, the roads are in a remarkably good condition almost everywhere. So with that said, let's explore. Hello everyone, and welcome to the third featured installment of the Hungary-Georgia-Armenia tour. So, we are in Tbilisi, the, let's call it, Georgian main capital, although the laws are no longer made here but in Kutaisi as per the decision of the former controversial president Mikhail Saakashvili. I'll probably have to make a separate video about that guy too. Anyway, when I travel, especially when I travel with the camera, intending to publish these kinds of videos to the channel, I try my best to book a place located as far away as possible from the tourist area. And this is for two reasons. First, because that's usually cheaper, although that's not a rule. In Lviv, Ukraine, for instance, it was more expensive. And there comes the second reason. I'd rather get to feel as much as possible from the real experience. And this is true for all countries. If you go into the touristy area of the capital city of any country, you will likely experience anything but the local feel of that country. So I stayed in this working-class neighborhood close to the Hrmangele metro station, and while locating the correct building can be confusing, even with Eastern European instincts, it was clearly the better choice. You get to meet the average working Georgian who is not poor, but also not wealthy enough to be disconnected from most people. In these working-class neighborhoods, the print of the Soviet Union is very visible. These images could have very well been taken in a neighborhood in Krakow, Kiev, Bucharest, Budapest, Belgrade or Sofia in various moments in the last 20 years. For instance, this one is cleaner than similar ones in Belgrade and less crowded than similar ones in Bucharest. So we'll take the metro and go towards the city center. The nice thing about Tbilisi is that transportation is reliable and cheap. One ride with the metro costs 50 tetri, which is about 20 cents. Buses cost 80 tetri or 30 cents. The cable car is 2.5 lari per ride, which is about $1, but it's totally worth it. And they have a universal card called Metro Money, which you can charge with cash and use it to pay for almost any type of transportation in the Tbilisi metropolitan area, but also several other spots. The metro system is fairly simple. There are two lines that meet at Sadguris Moedani, or Station Square, which should more aptly be called the Railway Station Square. I saw a lost Lithuanian tourist trying to figure out where the railway station was. Poor guy stumbled upon probably the only old lady in Tbilisi that did not speak Russian. The important stations have names in English, such as Sadguris Moedani, called officially Station Square, or Tavisuplebis Moedani, also called Liberty Square. And they are announced both in Georgian and in English in the public transport. The reason I insist that much on the metro is because I have met tourists who thought they don't need it, and then wondered why they have been walking for 3 hours straight and were still far away from where they wanted to get. The distances between the stations are huge. The shortened stations are 7 kilometers long. Most are much longer than that. So seriously, don't be cheap and wisely spend 20 cents or you'll die of dehydration. Oh yeah, Tbilisi is warm. Warmer than Kutaisi and warmer than most of Europe at any given moment in time, although less wet. So with that said, let's get into the upper part of the old town. To get there, you can climb an enormous amount of stairs, after you figure out the labyrinth of small streets, that is, or you can take the cable car, which comes with this nice view. Once you get on top, you get the first opportunity at panorama view over the city. The bridge you're looking at is a modernist piece opened in 2010. The Georgians hate it, but for some reason tourists flock to take pictures on it. Locally, the bridge is known as the Always Ultra Bridge for its semblance with the ladies' maxi pad. And I can't really argue against that. Officially, it's called the Bridge of Peace, and it's supposed to connect the old town with the new district across the Kura River, and for those who like shiny, expensive modernist stuff, is quite impressive. For instance, it has over 1200 LED fixtures, and every hour it also transmits a message in Morse code that renders the periodic table of elements and goes across 2 parapets every hour. The light's designer, Philippe Martineau, a Frenchman, considers this communication celebration of life and peace between people. You can clearly see that Tbilisi utterly lacks leftists. In a more quote-unquote civilized town like, let's say, Stockholm, such thing would have been deemed unacceptable since the periodic table is basically STEM, so it's patriarchy. Also, the periodic table is also known as the Mendeleev table around here, named after Russian chemist Dmitry Mendeleev, who published the first recognized version. So it's not just patriarchy, but white cishet patriarchy. Also, almost all of the elements in it were discovered and added by white cishet, mostly Christian men from white cishet countries, so yeah, only in this part of the world you can get away with this oppression. Alright, joking aside, the upper part of the old town is dominated by this statue, Kartlis Deda, or the mother of a Georgian. She holds a sword in her right hand for Georgia's enemies and a big cup of wine in her left hand for Georgia's friends. Also, notice that Georgians don't call themselves Georgian, but Kartvelians, and the name of the country in Georgian is Sakartvelo, or the land of the Kartvelians. The rest of the world calls it Georgia because, well, long story short, that's how the Persians called the place, starting with the root word Gurgan, which is wolf, and the region nearby was called by the Persians Gorgan, the land of the wolves, and everyone else found out about the place from the Persians. The Saint George symbolism came much later, namely with the firm establishment of Christianity and the adoption of the flag. By the way, it is not the Georgian flag that resembles England's flag, it's actually the other way around, because, you know, when Georgia had St. George's cross on its flag, England did not yet exist. This is a leitmotif in this country and of Armenia for that matter. Everything is really old, since the early beginnings of what we now call the Western civilization actually happened here. Further west from Kartlis Deda, there is the Narikala fortress. Initially established in the 4th century, it was expanded and rebuilt several times. Most of what you're seeing here is from the 16th and 17th century, which is about the time when Islamic invasions slowed down, or at the very least never made it up to the fortress. Besides that, the Caucasus is a seismic area, so further damage to the fortress was done in the big earthquake of 1827. In the lower court, there used to be a church built in the 13th century, but that one was also demolished by another earthquake. In 1997, the authorities built a new one that respects the 13th century design, but the interior is unimpressive. What is impressive is the very nice view that I couldn't have enough of that one can get from up here in the fortress. Now I'll show you some more of the old town later on, but now let's head to the Sioni Cathedral of the Dormition, or the Cathedral of Saint Mary of Zion, built in, get this, the 6th century. Essentially, this cathedral is older than Islam itself. Now, admittedly, only a tiny portion of it is still from the 6th century. Most of it was rebuilt in the 13th century because the initial church was, bulldozed by the Ottoman Empire. As it's routinely the case in the Orthodox world, the church has a rather strict dress code. But as it's routinely the case in Georgia in general, the enforcement is lax. And in this case, it makes perfect sense. Policing all the tourists in and out when there are 50 degrees Celsius outside, and likely more than that when I recorded these images, would simply be impractical. The interior has been mostly renovated in the 19th century, and there was the Friday evening mass being held, so I could not carefully look for the old inscriptions in it. But undoubtedly, for those interested in Orthodox pilgrimage, this church should be top of the list. There's more history here than all of the churches in Russia, Ukraine, Romania, Serbia, and Bulgaria combined. The old town in Tbilisi has had the advantage that at least nobody actively tried to destroy it in the last century, as it was the case in Bucharest and Kyiv. So now there is a real opportunity to make it great again. And Georgian small business owners are seizing every opportunity. There are still buildings that are not renovated, but almost all of those have construction site signs on them and are in the process of being rehabilitated. And the best part of the old town? Cats. Lots and lots of cats, all very well fed and friendly with tourists. And the biggest amount of kittens is nearby the KGB is still watching you establishment, because nothing annoys totalitarians more than mocking their sacred cows. In this establishment, I met the first Georgians who actually preferred English over Russian. Not to mention their food, which is just top notch.
It all comes out in static now. I see the way down. So we pave these floors with the bones of whose
Let's take the subway again and go to the Liberty Square. Oh, by the way, the subway is quite deep, but after seeing the Kyiv subway, it's hardly impressive anymore. But compared to most metro systems in the Intermarium or Europe in general, the Tbilisi metro system is deep. The Liberty Square was built in the 19th century under Imperial Russia, and it was called the Yerevan Square. In Soviet times, it was called the Lenin Square, and in the middle of it stood a huge statue of Lenin. After independence, the Lenin statue was taken down and replaced by this monument of St. George. Located on the eastern end of Rustaveli Avenue, here's that name again, Liberty Square is still the center of high-class commerce and business deals, although it is no longer the administrative center, as the headquarters of the City Hall was moved into a bigger, modernist building, and the old City Hall is to become a museum starting next year. Now that I mentioned Rustaveli Avenue, let's take a walk on it, because that's where we find the National History Museum, which is the only place that I wanted to videotape inside, but was not permitted to do so. But until we get to the museum, this building is of relevance too. Here functioned the parliament until 2012, when Mikhail Saakashvili's decree to move the parliament to Kutaisi has been implemented. The building is still not open for visitation, but there are plans to turn it into a museum in itself, which I'm looking forward for it to happen, because this building has been the site of the very last act of brutal Soviet repression and persecution against its subjects. While other Soviet socialist republics managed to declare their independence more or less peacefully, Georgia wasn't that lucky. It had a lot to do with the fact that the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Soviet Union in 1990 was Eduard Shevardnadze, a Georgian Bolshevik and a deeply slimy and corrupt individual who let the minions do the dirty work of organizing a bloody coup against the Georgian national movement, and then he framed himself as a savior. Pretty much like Ion Iliescu in Romania, only much worse. The violent miners' strikes that Romania had to go through were kids' play in comparison to what Georgia has gone through because of the Soviet Union, who held on to power through direct violence till its very last minute of existence. This is why I don't accept the official narrative of perestroika and glasnosti, or the smugness of Western leftists who now whitewash the Soviet history, claiming that the Soviet Union had pretty much calmed down towards the end of the 1980s. Well, a Republic of Georgia begs to differ. They felt the very real Soviet boot on their necks and Soviet bullets in their heads right until the bitter end of the evil empire, and then some more as Shevardnadze intertwined himself in power, which led to a small-scale civil war. Oh, and add on top of that the Moscow-backed separatist regions of Abkhazia and Ossetia. Or as they say in Moscow even today, business as usual. The History Museum is well maintained, but the section that indeed marks the visitor is the section dedicated to Soviet occupation, because it modestly and quietly tells the story of a people shred into pieces by the Soviet Union. And to make things worse, it is the story that is still openly denied and oftentimes ignored, especially outside Georgia, though I have seen Antifa stickers in Tbilisi, so they have their own miserable scum as well. Relatively close to the museum, there is also the famous Tbilisi flea market, which I have to admit did not impress me at all. Much poorly stocked than, let's say, the Odessa flea market. And the few things that were of interest to me were sold at inflated prices. However, a few Australian tourists found stuff that were useful to them, so there's that. Now, this is the Guardian of the museum, and I put this short footage in here because now we're heading towards something really infuriating. We're going to Stalin's printing press in the Museum of the Georgian Communist Party, where we were given a tour by the president of the Georgian Communist Party, and I wish I were joking. This museum is well hidden, in the sense that it's not mentioned in any printed tourist guide, and if you ask the locals, they'll say it doesn't exist, and I don't blame them. To get here, take the metro to Samasi Arkhveli. Samasi is the number 300, so you'll spot the station easily. Then look for the Kaspi Street. It used to be a good trick to ask the locals for the Kaspi Street instead of the Komi Museum, but of course the trick didn't last long. The lady at the grocery store at the intersection of Arkhveli Street with Kaspi sighed deeply when she answered yes to my question on whether that street was indeed the one I was looking for. The museum is at the end of the street, and the guy running it is both figuratively and literally the loon at the end of the street. So here it is, the Museum of the Avlabari Illegal Printing Office of the Caucasian Union Committee of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, named after Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin. Getting inside this place is a portal straight into the Soviet Union. Everything is just in Russian. If you don't speak Russian, get your own Russian speaker because, as the president of the Communist Party explained to me and the Chinese group of tourists, the government doesn't support this establishment. In fact, the government wanted to blow it up entirely. So it runs entirely on donations that barely cover renovations and upkeep. So employing English speakers is way beyond the realm of financial possibilities. Some would say that the market has just decided. But don't tell that to Mr. President. He will cry. And I'm not joking. At one moment he had tears in his eyes when we got to the part of the tour where he had to explain methodically how the Soviet Union was dismantled. Anyway, this place officially doesn't exist. There is no website, no opening hours, no official entrance fee or anything else that would suggest this is a museum. But museum it is, and the guided tour is remarkable. Now mind you, I still wanted to helicopter this dude at the end of the tour, but that's besides the point. Anyway, so a bit of background story. The basement we're in now is the actual basement in which Stalin and his comrades sat around at the turn of the 20th century to print illegal newspaper. Mind you, this was Tsarist Russia. Georgia had not achieved independence yet, and subversive communist activity was illegal. So as the guide explains to us, the basement had a primitive air conditioning system so the commies won't suffocate to death, while sometimes having to stay in there for 2 days if the Imperial Gendarmerie came on the street at the wrong moment. They also had a sound alarm that could be triggered from the kitchen above the basement. According to the guide, the house above would do its best to appear as a normal house operated by a regular bourgeois housewife, who was in fact also a member of the Communist Party. She would let them know from the kitchen if the gendarmerie was around so they would stop the printing press and avoid drawing attention to the house. The printing press, a German machine manufactured in Augsburg in 1893, was extremely noisy, as the guide explains, but, and this is a direct quote, it served the interests of the party and world Bolshevism really, really well, close quote. Here in this room with this printing press, the first Bolshevik pamphlets were written. Basically, the story of Bolshevik propaganda started here about 105 years ago. The guide will spend an enormous amount of time explaining to you the network of tunnels that still do exist today that would have allowed the commies to get away even if the imperial police would have raided the compound. That was not necessary, however, because the compound was discovered a bit after the Bolsheviks had fled Tbilisi, and the house above this basement was blown up, though not all of it burned down at the time. Enough artifacts survived for this museum to be rebuilt at the height of Stalin's power in the 1930s and repopulated with mostly original artifacts. But the house itself that you visit today is a replica built on Stalin's indications. The original, as I said, was destroyed by, as the guide would say, quote, the imperialist, capitalist, counter-revolutionary Tsarist regime, unquote. In fact, the guide is by far the most fascinating exhibit in this museum. The guy speaks like Lenin or Khrushchev used to speak. For instance, at one moment, when he would mention that the government doesn't support the museum, he referred to the current administration as, quote, the temporary counter-revolutionary oppressive regime, unquote. He also referred to the Georgian national movement as, quote, those petulant hooligans who weren't dealt with in time and thus ended up installing a counter-revolutionary regime, unquote. And you can't take him out of this framing at one moment because too much Bolshevik framing in the Russian language became confusing to me. I asked for clarifications in terms like, you mean when the USSR fell and communism was abolished in Georgia, right? To which he replied, yeah, whatever you tourists call it, the installation of the counter-revolutionary regime, that's what I'm talking about. And it goes on and on like that for almost an hour. Now, admittedly, the tour lasted a bit longer because we spent extra time with me translating to Chinese tourists from Russian to English. After the Chinese tourists left because they had begun the tour earlier than myself, he also referred to them as, quote, improper Chinese, since back in the days the Chinese would study some Russian in school and could have a normal conversation with them like a normal human, unquote. I haven't heard that type of phrasing since early 1990s when I would hear on TV random old Bolsheviks from Republic of Moldova. That phrasing comes from the chauvinistic Soviet Russian mentality, which goes pretty much like this. Do you want to be an actual human being? Then learn the Russian language. Nothing that I may say can even begin to describe this surrealistic experience you get if you visit this place and actually understand what the guy is saying. Anyway, after the basement, we go in the cover house where the kitchen used to be, so we can see how they would lift the papers and also the people from the basement. But it gets a lot more interesting when you visit the living room. The guide insists the picture on the wall with Stalin operating the printing press is original from 1916, taken a short while before the Bolsheviks fled the place for good. And in his words, quote, good that they fled because 3 weeks later the Imperial Gendarmerie raided the compound, unquote. According to him, 50 officers were part of the raid that are responsible for the destruction of some of the original artifacts of which we can now see copies of. Also, in this room there is the printing press, also a German model, that was used to print the proclamation of the Soviet Socialist Republic of Georgia in 1920, which served as justification for the Red Army to invade a few months later in 1921. And then if you go to the next room, where according to the guide back in the days people would flock to go to, namely the room that has Stalin's bed in it and was also Stalin's personal library. Needless to say, the room is full of books by Marx, Engels, early writings of Lenin, as well as smaller far-left writers that had been translated into Russian at the time. There are also a few books that are out of place. For instance, I saw one that was edited in 1931, which clearly could not have been in the original room. But hey, it's a communist museum, so suspension of disbelief is kinda mandatory. The president of the Communist Party also recommended us that we go to Baku to see the secondary museum at Stalin's first girlfriend, Nina, which also served as a gathering place for illegalists. That museum is represented through this mock-up here. I'll visit that one too when I'll be lucky enough to get an Azerbaijani visa. Alright, and from now on it goes full propaganda. Until now, at least, there were some independently verifiable historical facts and artifacts, but from this point on, it's all pure propaganda. So we first got to visit his cabinet, which has more red in it than the actual cabinets of the actual directors of Soviet institutions had 30 or 40 years ago. Here he explains how he was a history professor in his active life and also volunteered for this museum in late Soviet times. But then capitalism came around and people wanted to shut this down. So he fought them, including in court, to keep it open under the promise that he won't demand a shekel of taxpayers' money. He earned the right to keep the museum open, but he decries the fact that nowadays the magazine of the Communist Party is only symbolic, as they can't afford to print more than a few issues per edition. But what he decries the most of life under capitalism is that the whole support network around these museums vanished entirely, as younger people don't want anything to do with this, older people die one by one, and even people his age or slightly younger prefer to spend time with their grandchildren or take a vacation abroad than engaging in any of this. He's basically decrying that people are actually free to choose not to be communists. He's still not content with that, but he has made peace with many of them and accepted that while he is an enthusiast, most of the rest of the planet, well, isn't. Oh, and by the way, remember those pictures with Soviet soldiers putting the red flag over the Reichstag at the end of the World War II? Yeah, those two soldiers were Georgian soldiers, and he takes pride in having one of the few quote-unquote authorized copies of that flag. This was also the only moment when I saw this guy acting as a Georgian. Throughout the rest of the tour, he spoke and acted like a born and raised Russian Soviet apparatchik. In other news, he shows me the #1 edition of Pravda with a big editorial by Lenin on the front page. Again, the paper is not original, but an authorized copy. Apparently, around 500 authorized copies of the first edition of Pravda were made in the 1930s, specifically for this network of museums. Oh, and by the way, the phone you see on his desk, that one is not for show. It actually works. Now, dialing correctly from cell phone to landlines requires you to know the numbering rules of Soviet telecom practice. Then you get even more propaganda, but also some pics that you might have never seen, such as pictures from Stalin's meetings with Mao Zedong, or collages of Stalin's picture when he was young, when he was at the height of his power, and when he was old. Also, a lot of Stalin's writing in Georgian. Now, that was news to me. I had no idea that Stalin wrote that much in Georgian, although, considering the place we're in, I'm still not convinced that those are indeed Stalin's writings. But besides the Lenin's original writings and many other texts from early Bolshevism, let me play you this particular segment, because if I tell you that Bolshevism is a cancer that spread in the West a long time ago, you may say I'm a conspiracist. So here's an actual honest-to-God Bolshevik explaining it to you.
Это революционная карта России, Азии, Европы там часть есть. Вот это Кавказ, Грузия, Армения, Азербайджан, Туркменистан, это Россия, Тюмень, Нижний Тагил, Москва, Тула, Петербург, Киев, Харьков, Стокгольм, Швеция, Лондон, Париж, Женева. Вот эти значки, все революционные центры, и они между собой товарищи были, помогали друг другу. А Ленин, эмиграции, находился в Женеве, в Лондоне, в Стокгольме. Он прятался, хотели арестовать, и он прятался туда-сюда, и вот лидер революции 1917 ура, социализм.
Да, очень хорошо. Are we clear? Make no mistake, it is cute old pity-worthy grandpas like this one that facilitated the murder of tens of millions of people in the Soviet Union and elsewhere. When I was looking at this guy, he bore a lot of semblance with Alexandru Vișinescu, a Romanian Bolshevik torturer currently serving a 22-life jail sentence for crimes against humanity, or more like Ioan Ficiur, another Romanian Bolshevik who tortured several hundreds of people and facilitated the death of over 100 people for the crime of not being communists. He's also serving a 20 years jail sentence for crimes against humanity, and he's pretty much like this guy. He's a cute old grandpa, almost pity-worthy, until you realize that these people are some of the most dangerous motherfuckers still alive. Now, after so much of this, I had to go to the bar that mocks communism and has friendly kittens. I mean, nothing cleans anger more than a huge plateau of rich, plentiful, and tasty capitalist food, a bit of capitalist brandy, and some friendly kittens to pet. last but not least, another less known by tourists but also impressive landmark in Tbilisi is the Chronicles of Georgia sculpture and architecture complex that is still under construction. Most people living in Tbilisi have no idea it exists. I was lucky that I caught a bus driver who knew where it was because one of his relatives works at the project, but generally this is an easy to miss landmark. Getting here is not that hard. Go by metro to Hermangele, which I did not have to since I was living in that neighborhood, and then take the bus 65 and tell the driver where you want. Because if you don't tell the driver, you end up walking through the sun for about 4 kilometers while walking uphill. The structure is impressive first and foremost through its dimensions. I mean, look here when I caught the Japanese tourists in the frame as well, just to show you how small they are. But other than old Asians who come with a prepaid tour to include this landmark, the lady at the bar nearby told me that the number of tourists is still low, partly because the structure is still not officially ready, although it really is mostly ready. The adjacent structures, the museums, those are still far from finished, but the monument itself is more than 95% finished, and they were still working on it when I was here. This ensemble is meant to follow the Caucasus, or the so-called Georgian Chronicles, which are a series of texts written between the 9th century and the 14th century, documenting the history of the proper Kingdom of Georgia. In addition to that, this monument also has scenes from biblical times and also more recent scenes, and by recent I mean from between the 14th and the 17th century. I haven't noticed anything more recent than that. Now, I don't know about you, but I think this is glorious, and it's too bad that it's not more known even to the locals, which is weird because it's very close to a popular destination, namely the beach to what they call the Tbilisi Sea, which is really not a sea, but just a bigger than usual reservoir. But while people, both native and tourists, flock to that beach, almost nobody ventures 2 kilometers upwards to see this beauty. Oh, and the view. This is the best spot for panoramic shots. All you need is a tripod and a professional photo camera, and you can take some of the most amazing panoramic shots of Tbilisi. Admittedly, some of the angles are towards more dormitory, Soviet-like neighborhoods, but with good zoom, you can get the whole city. Alright, so after seeing this, I went shopping for food because a long night was following in the night train Batumi-Yerevan, which takes about 9 hours to get from Tbilisi to the Armenian capital. Just as I got accustomed to Georgia and really started to like the place, I had to leave and head towards Armenia, where some other shocks followed. But that will have to be explained in the next featured video. Ultimately, Tbilisi is definitely a city worth visiting. It's a remarkably clean, very safe city and with incredibly nice people. With that said, you haven't seen nice people until you've been to Yerevan. In Tbilisi, they won't follow you to turn you back if they noticed you took a wrong turn. In Yerevan, they will, because they don't want their visitors to get lost. In full fairness, if you're familiar with Eastern European cities, you can't really get lost in Tbilisi. Yes, it's big, territorially speaking, but it's also pretty straightforward, and you don't notice you're in a city founded in 479 AD. Yeah, it's from the 5th century. In Yerevan, now that's a whole different story, and I intend to tell it to you in great detail. Because although geographically Tbilisi and Yerevan aren't that far apart from each other, they are, in most ways, on different planets. The only noticeable things in common are that both tend to speak Russian with foreigners, they're both Christians, but not necessarily Orthodox, and they're both of the Caucasian phenotype. Well, duh. But other than that, be prepared, because a whole different world is coming up next. But until then, thank you all for watching, thank you for your continuous and generous support, thank you all who supported this tour, and I'll see you all soon on Freedom Alternative.